The axe bit deep into the pine, clean through the grain. Ezekiel Cain paused, breath curling in the cooling air, and set the final log atop the growing stack. Dusk had slipped across the valley like smoke, quiet, patient. Overhead, storm clouds muscled in from the west, fat with rain and rumbling like some old god's belly. Zeke glanced once at the horizon and wiped sweat from his brow with a worn sleeve. A man who lived alone learned to listen to storms. But tonight, it wasn't the thunder that made the hair rise on his arms. He felt her before he saw her, that strange tightening in the gut, like a predator too long unseen. Then movement, a flash of white against the dusk-shadowed fence line. He turned, hand drifting toward the rifle by the chopping block. But it wasn't a threat that crossed the gate. It was a woman. She staggered forward through the wooden arch like something torn from a fever dream. A wedding dress, torn and soaked, clung to her like a shroud. The veil flared in the wind behind her, trailing lace and blood. She moved with the faltering gait of someone too hurt to cry out, arms loose at her sides, face slack with shock. For a second, Zeke couldn't move. 15 years of silence held him like chains. Then she collapsed. The gravel scattered beneath her as her body hit the earth, face down. Zeke was on her in 3 strides. He rolled her gently, fingers already wet. Blood, fresh, running through the lace in a slow pulse. There was a knife in her back, buried to the hilt between the shoulder blades. White gloves. That detail stuck out, oddly neat amid the ruin. "God damn," Zeke muttered, voice low, almost reverent. Not fear, recognition. The kind of wound meant for silence, not survival. He lifted her in his arms, light as smoke, colder than the wind. Inside the cabin, he laid her on the kitchen table, swept clear with one rough motion. The fire was already going. He stripped the dress from the wound, sliced it away with his skinning knife, and set to work. Needle, boiled water, the old army kit. His hands remembered. Scar tissue along his ribs twitched as he stitched her flesh closed. She didn't wake, but she breathed. Thunder cracked above, echoing across the canyon. Rain came next, hard, hissing against the windows. Zeke stood over her in the lamplight, chest rising slow. Not since Carson City had he seen a wound like that. Not since his last bounty. Not since the last time he chose not to fire. Outside, the land drank the storm. Inside, a dead bride breathed. And Zeke Cain, once a ghost of justice, felt the earth shift beneath his boots. Peace, it seemed, had just run out. The rain beat steady through the night, a rhythm Zeke hadn't heard in months. It tapped against the window panes like cautious fingers, masking the woman's shallow breathing and the soft scrape of his chair legs against the floor. He hadn't slept. Not really. Every few minutes, he'd check her pulse, adjust the quilt, or re-wet the cloth across her forehead. The fever hadn't come yet, but he knew it might. Her skin was pale under the lamplight, lips tinged faintly blue, hair matted from sweat and blood. The knife had missed her spine by an inch, a miracle in itself. He dug it out with trembling fingers, stitched the torn muscle with quiet precision. It wasn't the first time he'd patched up a dying body on that table, but it had been long enough that his hands felt it. At some point before dawn, she stirred. Her mouth moved without sound. Her eyes fluttered, then closed again. He leaned closer, listening, unsure if she was slipping deeper or clawing back. Then her voice came, barely a whisper, so thin he almost missed it. "Maribel." Zeke leaned in, still as stone. "That your name?" She nodded once, eyelids heavy. Her fingers gripped the edge of the quilt like she was holding onto something real. "Roan. Maribel Roan. I ran. Before the vows." The words hit strange in the dark. Zeke sat back, watching her closely. He didn't press, not yet. Let the story come when it was ready. She drifted again, lost in some inner fog. An hour passed, maybe 2. The rain slowed to a drizzle, soft and reluctant. The first light of morning touched the edge of the curtains, pale as bone. Zeke stood, poured himself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and drank it standing over her. When she spoke again, her voice was clearer, hoarse, but focused. It was him, Nathaniel, my husband. He killed her, his first fiancée. Arranged it, made it look like fever. Zeke didn't respond. He just stared out the window, eyes on the soaked earth, where fresh wagon tracks still glistened in the mud. I found letters, Maribel continued, hidden in his father's desk. He planned to do the same to me. After the dowry cleared, I was never supposed to leave that church alive. Zeke turned to her, his face unreadable. Did you see who stabbed you? She shook her head weakly. Only the gloves, white, and a ring, gold, thick, wedding band. Zeke's jaw tightened. The memory of a case long cold stirred in the corners of his mind. Another woman, another set of gloves, and a killer no one could touch. You're lucky, he said quietly, and meant it. Whoever wanted you dead knew how to finish a job. Her eyes filled, but she held them back. I didn't know where else to go. I ran and ran. I just kept moving. Zeke finished his coffee and poured another without asking. He didn't offer her any comfort, just heat, safety, and time. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere to the east, the hills echoed with distant hoofbeats. He watched her fall back into sleep, chest rising steady now. He knew what came next. A woman like that didn't stagger into a stranger's arms by accident. And men who wore white gloves didn't give up easy. Peace was gone, and something old was waking inside him. By late morning, the rain had thinned to mist, and the ground steamed as the sun pushed through the cloud break. Zeke stood outside the cabin, sharpening his old skinning knife on a whetstone, each drag slow and measured. He watched the horizon, listened to the stillness that came after a storm. No birds, no wind, just silence pressing in like a held breath. Something in the quiet felt wrong, too clean. Behind him, inside the cabin, Maribel slept in uneven stretches. Fever hadn't taken her yet, but her strength was threadbare. Zeke had moved her from the table to the cot by the hearth, wrapped her in wool and quiet. He didn't ask more questions. Not yet. He didn't need to. Her few words had already opened doors he thought he'd nailed shut for good. The Roan name wasn't new to him. He remembered it from before the war, from his bounty days when he'd ridden through backwater settlements and lawless canyons chasing ghosts no one else wanted to touch. There were whispers even then. Land disputes that ended in missing persons. A ranch hand found face down in a river, head caved in. A girl from Carrion Flats who vanished the night before her wedding, leaving only a white shoe and a broken locket. Each case different, each thread pulled from the same rotten cloth. But the Roans were rich, careful, and tied to half the judges from the territory line to the capital. Zeke had followed one of those threads once, years back. A barmaid who'd gone missing near Sage Bluff. Her brother had paid Zeke in a sack of coins and a silver flask to find out what happened. Zeke remembered riding 3 days through canyons slick with summer heat, finding a shallow grave lined with limestone and marigolds. The girl's hands had been bound in lace. He never found the killer. Just a burnt handkerchief with the initials N.R. stitched in gold thread. Now the name was back. Roan, spoken by a dying bride in his bed. That wasn't chance. He sheathed the knife and stepped inside. Maribel stirred as he crossed the room, her eyes fluttering open. Her skin looked clearer now, breath deeper. She tried to sit, winced, and leaned back. "You shouldn't move," Zeke said as he poured water into a tin cup and held it to her lips. She drank with small, trembling sips. "I thought I was dead," she whispered. "Not yet," he replied. He studied her face, the shadow beneath her cheekbones, the tight lines at the corners of her mouth. "You said you had proof. Letters?" She nodded slowly. "In my bag. I dropped it when I ran." "Where?" "By the river, I think, near the trail below the Chapel Ridge. I don't know how far I got." Zeke stood and walked to the door. He pulled on his oilskin coat, then reached up to the mantel for his rifle. His hand hovered for a moment above a small wooden box tucked behind the clock. Inside was his old badge, tarnished and forgotten. He didn't open it. Instead, he looked back at her. "I'll find the bag." She watched him go, lips pressed tight. Outside, the land was thick with fog, the sky bruised and low. Zeke mounted his horse and turned toward the ridge, toward old ghosts draped in silk and secrets, toward whatever waited in the mud. He didn't ride fast. He rode like a man walking backward through memory. The trail to the Chapel Ridge was slick with runoff, mule tracks half drowned in mud, wagon ruts like scars across the hillside. Zeke followed them at a slow, steady pace, his rifle across his lap and his eyes never still. The morning fog clung low to the ground, winding between the cottonwoods in ghostly strands. Every so often he'd see a crow lift from a branch and vanish into the mist, wings cutting the silence like blades. Near the bend where the trail met the dry creek bed, he found the first sign, a splash of blood on a flat stone, nearly washed clean, then a few torn petals from a bouquet, white and crushed. 30 yards farther, he saw the bag. It lay beneath a thistle bush, half buried in silt, the strap tangled around a root. He dismounted and crouched, brushing aside the wet soil with careful fingers. The leather was scuffed and damp, but intact. Inside he found what he was looking for, a bundle of folded letters tied with green ribbon, a silver locket smeared with blood, and a narrow leather ledger no bigger than a child's prayer book. Zeke opened the ledger slowly. Names, dates, payments, locations. Most of the entries were written in a tight, deliberate hand, initials only, with cryptic notations like R. Whitechapel, S. Negotiated, and F. Settled. He recognized a few of the towns, Mesita Flats, Burro Bend, Carrion Hollow, all places where women had vanished and justice never came. One entry stopped him cold. C.M. Forfeited. Witness secured. He closed the book and stood slowly. A wind moved through the cottonwoods, soft but urgent. Crows stirred above him, restless. Zeke turned back toward the ridge. Below him, the valley stretched quiet and wide, the river swollen from last night's rain. But something in the stillness felt wrong. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the watching, the way the land held its breath. He saw them a moment later, 3 riders on the far bluff, black hats and oilskin coats, motionless in the fog. Too far to see faces, but not so far that their presence didn't strike like a hammer. They didn't move, just sat their horses and watched. Zeke didn't wave. He didn't run. He tucked the bag into his saddle and turned the horse slowly toward home, keeping his spine straight and his pace steady. It wasn't the first time he'd been watched by men like that. Hired eyes, guns paid to look for what others wanted buried. He arrived back at the cabin by midday, the sky thinning to a pale, bitter blue. Maribel sat up in the cot, face drawn, but her eyes clearer. He dropped the bag on the table. "Yours?" She nodded, reached for the ledger with trembling hands. "That book. It's everything, every deal, every woman." Zeke nodded slowly and glanced out the window. Then they'll be coming. Maribel looked up sharply. You saw them? 3 men, riders, same coats, just watching for now. She held the book tighter. They won't stop, not if they know I'm alive. Zeke crossed the room, knelt to open the floorboards near the hearth. From the crawl space, he pulled out a rusted metal box, then opened it with a key from around his neck. Inside were coils of barbed wire, a folded length of oilskin, 3 boxes of rifle shells, and an old sawed-off he hadn't touched in years. He didn't say a word. Maribel stared at the weapons, her breath quickening. You're preparing to fight? Zeke didn't look at her as he began laying traps in his mind. He only said, I'm preparing to survive. Outside, another crow lifted into the sky, silent and watching, as if it, too, remembered what he used to be. The sun hung low, a dull orange disk behind thinning clouds, casting long shadows across the cabin yard. Zeke worked in silence, looping wire between fence posts, burying sharpened stakes beneath patches of soft dirt, reinforcing the barn door with iron bolts he hadn't touched in over a decade. The air smelled of pine sap, old leather, and the faint metallic tang of storm-washed soil. Inside, Maribel sat at the table, the ledger open before her, lips moving as she read each line aloud in a whisper, not for Zeke, but for herself, as if speaking the names gave them weight, gave them a kind of afterlife. Zeke listened from the porch, the names drifting out like prayers spoken too late. Clara Mallory, Maggie Dunsfield, Eloise Ketter, all marked as forfeited. That means they didn't survive, doesn't it? Zeke didn't answer immediately. He stood with one boot on the porch rail, scanning the ridgeline, then replied without turning his head. It means someone thought their silence was worth paying for. Maribel looked down at the inked lines, one finger tracing a column labeled S. Resolved. They made it look clean, like bookkeeping, transactions. Her voice trembled. They killed them like they were liabilities. Zeke stepped back inside and lit the lantern, casting the room in soft amber. The Roans didn't build their empire on cattle alone. I always figured there was blood in their foundation, just never had proof worth the rope. Maribel looked up, pale but fierce. You tried once, didn't you? He met her gaze and pulled out a folded slip of yellowed paper from his coat pocket. It was a wanted poster, curled at the edges, bearing the face of a woman with haunted eyes and the name Catherine Vale. She was the one I chased through Carrion Hollow, vanished before I could speak to her. I found her locket in a creek, torn wide open like someone didn't want it found. Roans owned the land upstream. No one in the county said a word. Maribel swallowed hard and reached for the ledger again. Her name's in here. KV. June 10th, 3 years ago. It says, finalized through proxy. Zeke leaned in, eyes narrowing. Proxy means someone else did the killing. She nodded. White gloves, the man with the ring, maybe Nathaniel himself, or maybe someone paid to act in his name. The fire cracked softly in the hearth, sending a slow warmth through the room. Outside, the wind had died, leaving only the ticking of the wall clock and the creak of wood settling under the weight of years. Zeke spoke low, almost to himself. If we can get this to the capital, names and all, it won't just break the Roans. It'll burn half the damn tree they're roosting in. Maribel stared at the fire, eyes distant. That ledger's enough to hang a dozen men, maybe more. And enough to get you killed before sunrise if we stay too long. Zeke folded the wanted poster and tucked it into his breast pocket. We ride out tomorrow, before they stop watching and start moving. She looked at him then, not just with fear, but with something sharper, resolve stitched together by grief and rage, Will we make it? Zeke tightened the strap on his rifle. We have to. Outside, the trees stood still, waiting. By nightfall, the clouds had thickened again, pressing low and swollen with rain that threatened but hadn't yet fallen. The cabin stood like a solitary outpost against the creeping dark, lamplight glowing faintly behind the shutters, smoke curling steady from the chimney. Zeke sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, hat pulled low, boots planted firm. He wasn't waiting out of nervousness. He was waiting the way a wolf waits, calculating the wind, the angles, the distance between bone and shot. Maribel dozed in the cot behind him, the ledger hidden beneath the floorboards, her breath shallow but steady. She'd said all she could for now, and Zeke hadn't pressed. Truth had a weight to it, and she'd carried more than most. He'd spent the day tightening defenses, wiring the barn door shut from the inside, stacking rocks behind the back window, laying nails in the tall grass near the fence line. The kind of preparations a man didn't talk about, but remembered how to do without thinking. The first knock wasn't really a knock at all. It was the creak of saddle leather, the crunch of wet gravel, the soft, rhythmic clop of hooves coming slow down the trail. Zeke stayed seated, one hand resting lightly on the rifle's worn stock. 3 riders emerged from the tree line. Black hats, long coats. One led his horse by the reins, walking like a man in no hurry. The others flanked him loosely, scanning the land with eyes that had seen their share of blood. The man in front stopped at the gate but didn't enter. His voice was polite, almost casual. "Evenin'. Sorry to trouble you, sir. We're looking for a woman, young, may have passed through here in distress." Zeke didn't rise. He nodded once, slow. "Haven't seen a soul in days. Storm kept most folk in. You boys get caught in it?" The man smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Did. Rough one. Left tracks we've been following." His gaze slid to the barn, lingered. "Mind if we take a look around?" Zeke didn't blink. "I do mind, actually. Private land. Unless you've got a warrant or a badge, I'd ask you keep riding." There was a pause, just long enough for the air to tighten. One of the flanking men shifted in his saddle, hand inching near his belt. The lead rider held up a gloved hand, signaling calm. "Didn't mean to offend, mister. Just looking to keep folks safe. That woman we're searching for, well, she's sick. Might be confused. Dangerous to herself." Zeke stood now, slow and deliberate. He rested the rifle casually against the porch rail. "If she's out there, she won't last the night in this cold. Best you keep moving before it catches you, too." The man studied him a moment longer. He looked like someone who'd learned to measure people the way a gambler reads a table. Whatever he saw in Zeke made him tip his hat once and turn away. "Much obliged," he said, mounting his horse. "You see her, send word. Name's Roan." Zeke watched them ride off without speaking. He waited until their silhouettes vanished behind the trees, then slipped back inside, bolting the door behind him. Maribel sat up, eyes wide. "They were his men, weren't they?" she asked, voice thin. Zeke nodded. "Roan's blood runs deep, and it just knocked on our door wearing manners." She clutched the quilt tighter. "They'll come back." "Yes," he said quietly, as he moved to the window and checked the moonlit ridge beyond. "But next time, they won't ask permission." Rain came just after midnight, soft at first, then harder, hissing against the roof like whispered warnings. The land turned slick again, the dirt swallowing prints as fast as they were made. Zeke lay awake in the chair by the hearth, boots still on, rifle resting against his knee. His eyes flicked toward the window every few minutes, catching the shadows that danced along the wall. He didn't trust the dark, not tonight. Maribel slept in fitful starts. Her fever had broken, but exhaustion still gripped her like a drowning hand. Each time she stirred, she'd mumble something. Names, dates, fragments of ceremony and fire. At one point, she reached for him in her sleep, fingers brushing air before falling back to her chest. Zeke didn't move. He just watched the door. The first sound was too subtle to startle a man like him. Just the quiet rattle of a gate swinging open, then closing. Then the faint crunch of footsteps on wet gravel. Not horses this time. Foot soldiers. Zeke stood slowly, taking the rifle in one hand and the oil lamp in the other. He moved to the far wall and opened the cabinet, retrieving the sawed-off he'd cleaned earlier that day. 2 barrels, short range, no warning. He tucked it into the holster nailed to the inside of the front door, just in case. The knock, when it came, wasn't a knock at all. It was the creak of a board outside the porch, followed by the metallic clink of a boot striking iron. Someone testing the edge of a trap, maybe stepping over one. Zeke's eyes narrowed. Whoever was out there had been warned and came anyway. Then a voice, low and sharp. "Cain, we know she's in there. This doesn't have to be hard." Zeke didn't answer. He stepped back from the window and blew out the lamp. A pause, then a footstep, then another. Zeke waited until he saw the shadow reach the doorframe before he pulled the trigger. The blast from the rifle lit the room in a white flash. Outside, someone screamed. Another figure dove off the porch, crashing into the mud. The trap near the fence snapped shut with a metallic shriek. Someone shouted for retreat. More gunfire cracked through the trees, bullets slamming into the side of the cabin like thrown stones. Maribel bolted upright, eyes wide, clutching the quilt. Zeke was already reloading. Calm, efficient, one shell after the other. She opened her mouth, but he cut her off with a glance. "Stay down." That's what it meant, and she understood. Outside, footsteps pounded into the dark, pulling away. One man groaned in the yard, caught in the wire, crying out for help. Zeke didn't move to finish him. Let the land do its work. After 10 minutes, silence returned. Zeke stood in the open doorway, rain slicking his coat, watching the tree line. No more movement. No more voices. Only the broken rhythm of wounded breath and the smell of powder in the air. He turned back to Maribel, voice like gravel. "First warning's done." She stared at him, pale, trembling, but not surprised. "They're going to kill us." Zeke shook the rain from his hat and set it on the peg by the door. "They're going to try." He shut the door behind him and bolted it once more. The fire burned low, its light casting amber shadows across the wooden floor. Smoke from the earlier gunfire still lingered faintly in the cabin, mixed with the smell of damp wool and iron. Zeke sat at the table, sleeves rolled up, hands blackened with powder and dirt, the ledger open in front of him like a wound split wide. Maribel sat across from him, blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, her hands trembling slightly as she turned each page. Neither spoke for a long time. There was only the sound of shifting paper and the occasional creak of the old rocking chair by the window, swaying faintly as if some ghost still sat there, waiting for the end of a story it once knew. Zeke pointed to a line near the center of the ledger. "That mark there, triangle with a bar through it. That's not just a location, that's a transaction. You see the date? That's when they bought out the claim rights in Carrion Hollow." Maribel leaned closer, brow furrowed. Same week Catherine Vale disappeared. It matches. They cleared her out to secure the land. "And they made it look like she vanished on her own," Zeke added, voice low. "Letters forged, witnesses paid or buried. They used these pages to document it all, not to hide it, to prove control. This ledger isn't just record-keeping. It's a map of their empire, built on what they erased." She flipped the page and stopped, finger trembling over a name, Agnes Barlow. "She worked in my family's household when I was young. She left one day and never came back. I asked my father where she went, and he said she'd run off with a man. But here," her voice cracked, "here it says, AB, neutralized, 3-4-68. Zeke reached for his flask, unscrewed the cap, and took a long pull. The whiskey burned sharp in his throat, clearing the grit from his voice. "We don't have time to go through every name, but we've got more than enough. If we can get this to Marshal Hart in the capital, he'll act. He's one of the few left who hasn't sold a piece of himself to the Roans." Maribel looked at him, wary. "What makes you so sure?" Zeke closed the ledger gently and placed it into a saddlebag at his feet. "Because I nearly killed him once, and he still gave me a second chance." She stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or cry. He didn't explain. Outside, the storm had moved east, leaving behind a brittle quiet. The ground was soaked, every hoofprint turned to mud, but the road would hold if they left by morning. The Roan's men wouldn't be idle. They'd regroup, wait for word from the one who never returned, and when they realized no word was coming, they'd come back stronger. Zeke knew how men like that thought, because he used to be one of them. Maribel rose slowly, walked to the window, and parted the curtain with 2 fingers. Her reflection hovered ghost-like in the glass. "If we make it, if the truth gets out, do you think it'll change anything?" Zeke stood, checked the saddlebag one last time, then looked at her, eyes dark and steady. "No, but it'll burn the Roans to ash. And maybe that's enough." The fire hissed softly behind them, smoke curling toward the ceiling. Outside, the land held its breath again. Tomorrow they would ride. First light broke over the canyon in bruised streaks of lavender and gray. Fog clung low along the creek bed, softening the outlines of trees and blurring the fence posts into spectral silhouettes. Zeke finished packing the horses in silence. Maribel stood beside him, boots thick with mud, her face pale, but set with the kind of determination that doesn't need to be spoken aloud. The saddlebag with the ledger was wrapped twice in oilskin and strapped to the underside of his horse, hidden beneath a blanket roll. Every piece of gear was checked twice, every strap pulled taut. This ride would not allow for second chances. They didn't take the main road. Zeke led them along a game trail that wound through the lower ridges, sheltered by pine and scrub oak. The air was cold and sharp, filled with the scent of wet bark and churned earth. They spoke little. Words felt too loud out here, like a lantern held high in enemy territory. Maribel rode close behind, her posture stiff but steady. Each bend in the trail brought a fresh uncertainty, but she didn't flinch. Zeke glanced back at her once and saw her hand resting near the small pistol he'd given her, an old percussion revolver, short-barreled and light. She had asked him how to load it the night before. He'd shown her, and she hadn't asked twice. By midday, the sun had burned away most of the fog, revealing a sky stretched thin and cloudless. They paused at a ridge overlooking a dry arroyo, letting the horses drink from a shallow pool. Zeke knelt by the water, cupped a handful to his mouth, then stood with his eyes scanning the horizon. Tracks. 3 sets. New, less than a day old. Riders had passed through, maybe scouts, maybe worse. Maribel followed his gaze. "Are we ahead of them?" "For now," he said, pulling the reins gently and leading his horse back up the trail. "But that won't hold. They'll be looking for choke points, river crossings. We have to move faster." She mounted again without hesitation. "How much farther?" "If we ride hard, 2 days, 1 if we don't sleep." He hesitated, then added, "There's a relay station east of Birch Hollow. If we make it there, we can get word to Hart. After that, it's just a matter of surviving the ride to the capital." They pushed on. The trail narrowed into a winding pass that curled through limestone cliffs and switchbacks. In places, it was barely wide enough for the horses to step without brushing the stone. Zeke led with careful footing, always watching for signs of movement above. Ambush country. He'd used it himself once, years ago, to track a rustler who bled out under the same cliffs they now rode beneath. By dusk, they reached a grove where the land widened enough to rest. Zeke gathered dry kindling from beneath the pines and started a small, smokeless fire. Maribel sat with her back to a rock wall, knees pulled close, staring into the flame. Her hands were raw, scraped from rains and cold wind, but she didn't complain. "They'll keep coming," she said, her voice barely audible, "even if we get there, even if they hang Nathaniel. The Roans have cousins, lawyers, allies." Zeke fed another branch into the fire, watching the embers glow. "Then we make sure what's in that ledger doesn't vanish. We leave copies, we name names, and we do it loud." She nodded, eyes distant. "I never thought justice would feel this lonely." He looked at her, then down at his hands, rough and lined with scars. Justice isn't a feeling. It's a price. That night they didn't sleep long, just enough to let the horses rest. Zeke lay with one hand on his rifle, the other tucked beneath his coat. In his dreams he saw the Roan estate burning, but in the smoke he couldn't tell if it was justice or revenge that lit the match. The river cut through the landscape like an old scar, swollen from rain and thick with silt. They reached it by mid-morning, after 6 hours of hard riding through brush-choked canyons and narrow deer trails. Zeke stopped at the edge of the bank, reins slack in his hands, eyes scanning the opposite shore. There was no bridge here, only a ford he remembered from years ago, where the rocks sat shallow and the current ran slow enough to cross without swimming. But today the water moved fast, brown and churning. Spring runoff had raised the level by a foot, maybe 2. He glanced at the sky, gray again with distant thunder. "We cross now, or we don't cross at all," he said, dismounting to test the depth with a stick. Maribel tightened the strap on her saddlebag and nodded. "Then we cross." Zeke led his horse into the water first. The animal hesitated, hooves slipping once on the slick stone, but Zeke kept it steady with quiet, deliberate movements. Midway across, the current surged against his legs, cold and strong, tugging at the hem of his coat. He reached the far side and turned just as Maribel's mare stepped into the shallows. That was when the shot rang out. It came from the ridge above, sharp and echoing, followed by the crack of splintering wood as a bullet tore through a branch behind them. Zeke dropped to a crouch, drawing his rifle in one motion, eyes scanning the bluff. Maribel froze midstream, her horse panicking beneath her. Another shot snapped past her head. "Ride!" Zeke shouted as he fired twice toward the rocks above. The first round hit dirt, the second sparked off stone. Maribel kicked her horse forward, gripping tight as it thrashed against the current. Zeke saw her mouth open in a wordless cry as she leaned low over the saddle. A third shot hit the water just behind her, sending up a spray of foam. Then she was across, falling from the saddle into the mud as the mare scrambled up the bank. Zeke rushed to her side, pulled her behind a downed log, and checked her over. No blood, no hit, just shock. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts, but she nodded when he met her eyes. He peeked out again and saw 2 figures shifting on the ridge. Too far for accurate shooting, but close enough to harass, to slow them down. He fired once more, forcing them back, then turned to Maribel. "We move, now." She stumbled to her feet, hands slick with mud, and followed him into the trees. They didn't stop until the river was a whisper behind them and the forest thickened into a tangle of pine and alder. Only then did Zeke drop to one knee, panting hard, pressing a hand to his side. Blood welled through his fingers. Maribel dropped beside him, wide-eyed. "You're hit!" "Grazed," he lied, though the burn in his side told him different. The bullet had carved through the flesh just beneath his ribs, not deep but messy. He clenched his jaw as she tore open his shirt and worked to pack the wound with strips from her underskirt. "You should have told me sooner," she muttered, voice shaking. "You had enough to worry about," he replied, managing a tight, dry smile. They rested there under the branches, hearts pounding in sync with the thunder rumbling above. For a long while, neither spoke. The pain settled into a dull throb. The ledger was still safe. They were still alive. But every mile now came with blood in its wake. Maribel finally looked at him, eyes glinting with something deeper than fear. "How many men have you killed, Zeke?" He didn't answer right away, just leaned his head back against the bark and exhaled. "Enough to know the river never forgets." Then he stood, slowly, bracing himself on a tree trunk. "We keep moving." They reached the capital outskirts just as twilight settled over the valley, casting the buildings in a soft, bruised light. Smoke curled from chimneys, and wagon wheels clattered faintly on cobbled streets below. The city stretched wide, bordered by river to the south and iron rails to the north, a place too big to silence but still small enough for a powerful family to control the rooms that mattered. Zeke and Maribel kept to the alleys, slipping between stables and livery yards, faces hooded, boots muddy and worn. Zeke's side bled through his shirt in slow pulses, but he didn't slow. The ledger was still wrapped beneath his coat, pressed flat against his ribs like a second spine. They stopped 2 blocks from the marshal's office, crouched behind a stack of hay bales beside a cart. The windows of the office glowed faintly. Inside, a figure moved behind the curtain. "That's him," Zeke said. "Marshal Hart. We give him the ledger, make him read it himself." Maribel looked down the street. Her jaw tightened. Too late. A black carriage rolled into view, wheels hissing against wet stone. 4 horses, 2 men on the box seat. And stepping out from within, dressed in a gray suit with gold buttons and gloves white as snow, was Nathaniel Roan. He walked slowly, measured, no hurry in his steps. A pistol hung at his side, holstered but ready. He glanced toward the marshal's office, then toward the shadows. He wasn't searching. He knew. Somehow, he knew they were close. Zeke gripped Maribel's arm. "We split. You go through the back alley. I'll draw him." "No." Her voice was sharp, fierce. "We end this now." Nathaniel turned as if hearing her and began walking toward them with a calm so absolute it unsettled the air itself. Maribel stepped from the alley, holding the pistol in both hands, arms straight. "Don't move." Nathaniel stopped, just short of the lamplight, and looked at her without surprise. His voice was soft, disappointed. "You should have stayed quiet, Belle." "You murdered them," she said. Her hands trembled, but the pistol didn't waver. "Agnes, Catherine, all of them. You wore gloves so no one would see the blood." He took a slow step forward. "You were meant to be my wife. You would have had everything." "I saw the ledger," she said. "You kill what you can't control." Zeke moved from behind the hay, his rifle raised. "Step back, Roan." Nathaniel turned slightly, regarding Zeke with faint recognition. "You're the one from Hollow Ridge, the old tracker. I thought you'd drunk yourself into the dirt by now." "Almost did," Zeke replied. "But you sent a bride bleeding through my gate. That woke me up." Nathaniel didn't draw. He didn't need to. A second man stepped from the carriage, taller, armed, a revolver already rising. Zeke fired first. The shot cracked through the evening, echoing off stone. The second man dropped before he could fire. Nathaniel moved, quick, grabbing Maribel's arm, twisting. Her pistol fired once, the shot wild. Zeke lunged forward, closing the space between them, his shoulder catching Nathaniel mid-twist. They crashed to the ground. The rifle skidded from his grasp. Fists, knees, the wet snap of bone, against bone. Nathaniel reached for his pistol. Maribel screamed. Zeke rolled, grabbed the pistol first, and fired point blank into Nathaniel's chest. Silence followed. Long, final. Maribel knelt beside Zeke, eyes wide, face streaked with rain. He groaned, blood darkening his coat. "You all right?" she asked, breathless. He nodded faintly. "Not dying yet." Behind them, the door to the marshal's office opened. Hart stood in the doorway, lantern in hand, surveying the wreckage. Zeke met his gaze. "We have a ledger. Names, transactions, deaths. It's over." Hart stepped forward. "Then give it to me. We'll make sure none of this stays buried." Zeke reached beneath his coat, drew the ledger, and handed it over. And just like that, the last roan fell. The city was quiet the morning after. Rain had passed, leaving streets slick with reflection and alleys swollen with runoff. In the marshal's office, the fire burned low, casting a soft orange light across the table where the ledger now lay open, its pages splayed like the ribs of something once hidden and now exposed. Marshal Hart moved through the room like a man carrying both burden and purpose. He read each page with deliberate care, his expression hardening with every name. Clerks came and went in silence, copying entries, dispatching messengers. Deputies rode out at dawn with sealed warrants tucked beneath their coats. Zeke sat near the window, a bandage tight around his ribs, the ache of the wound settling in like an old acquaintance. Maribel stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the pages being turned. Her dress was damp at the hem, her hair pulled back, face drawn, but unshaken. "They're arresting them?" she asked quietly. Hart looked up, tired but certain. "The ones we can reach, yes. The rest will run. Let them. This ledger is fire, and we're lighting it in every courthouse from here to Salt Lake." She nodded slowly, but her voice remained soft. "Will it last?" The marshal didn't lie. "Long enough to matter." Zeke shifted in his chair. "It'll outlive Roan. That's what counts." Hart stepped closer and rested a hand on the ledger. "How did you even come by this?" Maribel answered, her voice level. "I opened a drawer I wasn't supposed to, and I didn't look away." Hart gave a short nod, respect unspoken but present. Later outside, the streets began to fill with murmurs. News traveled fast, carried on the backs of riders and tongues of barkeepers. By midday, broadsheets bore headlines naming the Roan estate and a list of warrants longer than most sermons. There were whispers of buried bodies, of marriages that never were, of dowries exchanged for silence. Women began showing up to the courthouse, mothers, sisters, friends, carrying names long left unspoken, seeking justice in the light of day. Maribel stood on the courthouse steps, watching them come, one after another, steady as rainfall. Zeke joined her, coat buttoned against the chill. "You ready to leave this place?" She glanced at him, then back at the city. "Not yet. I need to make sure they write the names right, every single one." He didn't argue. Instead, he handed her something small. A silver locket. Tarnished. Dented. She opened it gently, revealing the tiny portrait of a young woman with a soft smile and a freckled face. "Catherine Vale," Zeke said. "I found it years ago. Didn't have anything to give her back then. Thought maybe this counts now." Maribel held it tightly in her palm. "She's one of many." "And you gave them all a name again," he replied. The city bell struck noon, a long echo rolling through the streets. Behind them, the crowd grew. Justice had been slow. It had come with blood and loss, and a trail soaked in rain and memory. But it had come. They returned to the ranch a week later, after the city had swallowed the last of its secrets and begun the slow, uneasy work of memory. Zeke rode with care, his ribs still bound tight beneath his coat, each breath reminding him of what it had cost to reach the end of the road. Maribel rode beside him, face wind-chapped, eyes fixed forward, no veil this time, no silk or lace. Just a wool coat, a wide hat, and the quiet gravity of someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side, knowing exactly what it took. The cabin stood untouched, weathered and familiar, the porch creaking gently as they dismounted. A hawk circled overhead, riding a high thermal, silent and watchful. The traps had rusted in the rain, the barbed wire bent under the weight of time. Zeke didn't move to fix any of it. They stepped inside. The air smelled of cedar and old smoke, of something abandoned and half-remembered. The cot still sat by the hearth, blanket folded, the ledger's absence leaving a small, noticeable void on the table. Maribel moved through the space slowly, fingertips brushing the mantel, the window frame, the place where she had nearly died. Outside, Zeke chopped wood, not out of necessity, but because the rhythm calmed him. The axe fell with steady precision, and the scent of fresh pine bled into the cold air. When she joined him, he didn't look up right away. She sat on the porch steps, hands clasped between her knees, eyes turned toward the low hills where crows still gathered at dusk. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked, not quite looking at him. "Every morning," he answered, "but I wake up here anyway." She smiled faintly, more breath than sound. "I might stay, just for a while." He nodded. "You're welcome. No one else left to claim it." They watched the sun settle behind the ridge, gold washing over the fields, turning mud to copper. Somewhere out past the tree line, a fox barked once, sharp and alone. The land breathed again, slow and cautious. Maribel rose and walked toward the old mine shaft beyond the barn. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers she'd gathered that morning. No cross, no marker, just a small offering to a place that had once hidden the dead. She laid the flowers at the edge and stood in silence. Zeke watched her from the porch, the axe forgotten in his hand. The wind shifted. It carried the scent of damp soil, old blood, and pine resin. He remembered every name, every woman lost, every road taken too late. He didn't ask for peace. He didn't expect it. But for the first time in years, he felt the land soften under his boots. Just a little. Inside the cabin, the fire caught, crackling steady in the hearth. Outside, beneath a sky rinsed clean by storm and ash, Ezekiel Cain and Maribel Roan stood on ground no longer running from its story. If peace was coming, it would come slow, but it would come.